So, our first guest is Dr. Pragya Agarwal, who is a behavioral scientist and author. She's the award-winning author of Sway, Unraveling Unconscious Bias. She's a behavioral scientist and a two-time TEDx speaker and founder of the research think tank 50% Project. So let's welcome Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And I hope, did I say your name correctly?
That was perfect.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. So you are widely applied, or you have a wide angle view of education. So I wonder if you can just talk briefly about how love shows up in your work in terms of as an educator and as a practitioner.
Yeah, I've been a long-time educator in US and UK universities, but besides that, I now run a consultancy work as well around biases and inclusivity, supporting organizations. I think my approach to this is creating non-judgmental spaces where people can talk honestly and openly about it. A lot of these conversations don't happen, sometimes because people get defensive about it. They focus so much on their intent, and we all like to think we are very egalitarian and fair-minded. So it seems very accusatory when we suddenly realize that actually I carry some implicit biases. So biases can be explicit and implicit, but implicit biases are something we often are not aware of, and they come through in our actions and decisions. And so it's really important to have these non-judgmental spaces where people can talk about their experience of microaggressions, their experience of facing any kind of discrimination and bias, but they can also have these discussions in a way that we focus on the intent. We focus on what we focus on the impact. What impact do these actions, these words can have on other people? I also like to talk about empathy and how research has shown that if people actively think about stepping into somebody else's shoes, they can create more empathetic connections with them. And when we create these connections, we can understand their perspective, these worldviews, because often we are stuck in these kind of echo chambers where we only understand the worldview that is echoed back at us, and we do not understand where other people are coming from. But from an information analysis perspective, we know that people have multiple perspectives on the same world, on the same situation, these different stories. So I think creating empathy can really help people as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned empathy, and as someone, I come out of the higher ed space, there's a lot of talk and discourse now about emotional intelligence. So how do you see the relationship between empathy as an expression of being able to operationalize love in the educational context and then emotional intelligence? So are they the same? Are they different?
I think emotional intelligence, I mean, it's a big topic. And simplistically speaking, as you would know, it's more about how we use our emotions to connect with people, and how we don't suppress or repress our emotions, because often we are told that we should be suppressing our emotions. We think about the emotional codes and rules in different workplaces, in different establishments, and we try and conform to them. There are also these notions of what different kinds of people, what emotions they can show or not, because these labels get associated with different communities of people, even with men and women, what emotions we can show. So I think emotional intelligence is about using our emotions in a clever, intelligent way to not only express our emotions, both positive and negative, but also be able to understand other people's emotions as well, so that we can make these connections, so that there's no gap between what they are trying to say and what we understand. We form these connections between our cognitive models.
That's so edifying and enlightening. So you mentioned earlier about non-judgmental spaces, and again, thinking about how love is operationalized within the context of education. What does it mean to create a non-judgmental space? What does that look like? So if teachers or educators are watching, how would they actually apply that? What are the strategies there?
Yeah, I think a non-judgmental space, some people call it safe spaces as well. But I think it's about not implying any judgment on the discourse that happens on it, where a person from any kind of perspective can come in and talk about whether they feel a sense of belonging in that workplace, in that educational establishment or not, because belonging is a really key sense for all of us, for all students, for all young people to feel a strong sense of identity. And we know that when we feel a strong sense of identity and self-worth, we are less likely to be biased and prejudiced against other people. So I think it's creating those spaces where we can come and talk about. They can be textual spaces where people write these notes anonymously if people are not comfortable, or they can be face-to-face conversations as well, or they can be group conversations where people talk about their experiences without any judgment imposed on them, or they can talk about what they felt or what are the barriers to these sense of belonging being created. So it can be written as well as face-to-face, as can verbal, all those kind of strategies that can be used.
So, in thinking about now from a policy angle, and again, from your kind of wide angle view of the educational landscape, are there any policies now as it relates to, let's look at higher education, that you find problematic or that we need to be attuned to so that we can kind of rally behind rectifying some of those? So just talk a little bit about some of the policies that, in terms of education, let's apply it to higher ed, that may be problematic going forward.
I think some of the, I mean, I'm in the UK, but I have a broader sense of the US perspective as well about how some of the terms around race and racism, for instance, are being misinterpreted. And some of the theories which can be used as strategies to understand systemic and structural imbalances are being misinterpreted as well, because they can be used to weaponize or discriminate or kind of divide people. And I think divisions, these lines of divides that we lay down, can be really problematic. So I think we need to have a broader sense of who we are, and we can only understand us in the present and going forward in the future if we understand our history really well. And I think in the UK at least, but also as I see from the US, I think having a broader, deeper sense of what our history is and addressing it in a very, again, a non-judgmental way, in an honest way. These are the things that happened in the past, not a filtered perspective of the past that we sometimes create. But these things happened in the past. How do we readdress these imbalances? I think young people of all ethnicities, of all racial backgrounds, really need to have a sense of where they come from. And so this is really, I think, key to it. I think there has been some misunderstandings about some of the race theories that have been going on as well. Big discussions in the US and in the UK as well, talking about unconscious bias as well. There's been a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions as well. So I think using a platform where we talk about race, racism, gender inequality, all those kind of discriminatory bias things that create these divides and give a sense to every child that they belong, that they are worthy, that they fit in. They don't have to pretend or code switch to be accepted in this society. And where we come from, again, I think history is really important. And I feel like the historical curriculum is really lacking in our education system.
Yeah, that's a critical point that you lifted up there about history and the way that curriculum is framed and contextualized. And a lot of times, as somebody who's oriented toward history and philosophy, the way that we teach it, the way that we engage it can be very compartmentalized. So I agree that, if you, again, talking about how do we operationalize love within the context of education, but being honest about history, but then approaching it from the perspective of this is a human story, right? And that each and every person and group or what have you has equally contributed to this great human story. You also mentioned, I heard you talk about the vocabulary and the language, and a lot of times, I mentioned this earlier in the session with Dr. King, language sets up the contours for how we engage with each other. Like, the word alien or illegal or what have you, that so many times these are the structures that really guide our engagement with one another. So really divesting even from those terms so that we can kind of engage a more holistic view of engagement, and so that we also embody mutual respect. So thank you so much for that. As a final question, what strategies do you have for practitioners in terms of how they can use love to transform the educational educational experience for our learners?
Yeah, as you say, I think reevaluating the images and the words that we use within our teaching, within our education, and approaching each child as an individual, not as part of a homogenized community, I think is really important as well. These stereotypes can be really harmful when we homogenize people, when we box people, categorize people, and we assign labels and stereotypes to them. That can be really harmful for a young person's self-worth, whatever age they might be, or for a person's self-worth as well. So I think approaching every person as an individual, thinking about their individual strengths and weaknesses and how we can tap into their potential the best is a really good strategy as well to break these stereotypes everywhere in the way that we teach, in the way that we approach the curriculum, in the language that we use. You say very rightly, it's so important because language is a lens on our society, but also the way that we shape our society and our cultural practices as well.
Yeah, thank you. Jamira, before we let Dr. Agarwal go, is there anything you'd like to say?
The only question I'm curious about, I think as a storyteller, we oftentimes resort to sharing our stories with folks to, expand on their empathy and their understanding of the diverse audiences. And so I'm curious, how can we ensure that we don't tokenize one-off experiences as a representation for all communities and really start to recognize the complexities of each and every one versus like looking for similarities and honing in on those?
I think this is a huge problem with representation, isn't it? When we have very few people from diverse communities talking about their stories, often they have the huge responsibility to represent their communities and their societies as well. I think, again, breaking away from stereotypes, and the more diverse stories that we hear, the more we bring in diverse people to tell their stories, the more we open up the space and create more seats at the table, the more we give voice to people who are marginalized, the more we can see that these are not homogenized experiences, that they are individual experiences. So I think it's a responsibility of everybody who has power and privilege to create these spaces to give more voice to the people who don't have voice at the moment, and not just to one or two and use them as tokens for representation.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dr. Agarwal, for lending us some of your time today. I am indebted to the impact that you've made. And so thank you again, and we look forward to circling back around on some of these conversations. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.